Jack Thompson adjusted his visor against the harsh glare of Eridani Prime's twin suns. The violet sands stretched endlessly before him, glinting like shards of glass under the twin stars' punishing heat. It was another day of isolation, another monotonous round of geological scans and mineral samples. The solitude was something he'd learned to live with, part of the job he'd signed up for. A few months in, and the vastness had a way of swallowing time, making him feel as though he were the last human left in the galaxy. He wiped the sweat from his brow, ready to return to the outpost, when his scanner began to beep, a high-pitched pulse indicating something alive. "That can't be right," he muttered, frowning at the screen. The scanner's life-form detection rarely activated on a planet this barren. A few low-life plants and microbial colonies had been discovered, but nothing more. And this signal was different, stronger, more distinct. Following the signal, he trekked through the violet dunes, climbing over jagged rocks and wading through sand drifts until he reached the edge of a ravine. His heart raced as he peered over the side, eyes scanning the shadows below. There, barely visible in the twilight, lay a figure half buried in the sand. Human-like, but different. Jack slid down the ravine, stumbling in his haste. As he approached, he realized this was no human. The girl, if he could call her that, had skin that shimmered faintly, like a sheen of opalescent colors shifting with each of his steps. Her hair flowed around her in soft waves, an unusual blend of silver and pale blue, dusted with sand. And her eyes, when they fluttered open, were a haunting shade of lavender. She looked at him, her gaze weak yet filled with an intensity that pierced through his very core. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, only a soft exhale that seemed to catch in the wind. She was starving, dehydrated, and utterly defenseless. Jack dropped to his knees beside her, pulling out his water supply. He gently lifted her head, offering her a small sip, careful not to overwhelm her. She sipped it with hesitation, but her eyes never left his. The intensity of her gaze unnerved him, yet he felt drawn to her, an odd sense of duty and protectiveness settling over him. What are you?" he whispered, as much to himself as to her. She murmured something, her voice melodic but entirely foreign. It was like music carried on a breeze, lilting and soft, but incomprehensible. Jack tried not to let the language barrier bother him. With a nod of understanding, he gestured toward himself, mouthing, "Jack." "Zara," she murmured, placing her hand over her heart. Her voice was faint, but the name was clear, resonating with a gentle warmth that made him smile despite himself. Zara. It suited her, like a word wrapped in starlight. He carefully lifted her, cradling her frail form as he made his way back to the outpost. Each step was measured. The rocky terrain was no place to carry someone, let alone an alien girl barely clinging to life. Zara lay silently in his arms, her head resting against his chest, her breathing soft but steady. It struck him how fragile she seemed, her skin almost translucent in the dim light. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought her here, to this desolate planet, and what kind of hardship she must have faced to end up in this state. When they reached the outpost, Jack set her down on his cot and scrambled to find anything that might help her recover. He fetched nutrient packs and water, then watched as she hesitantly accepted his offerings, savoring each morsel with a look of deep appreciation. She ate slowly, as though the food itself were a gift beyond measure. As the evening wore on, he found himself observing her more closely, fascinated by her otherworldly features. Her skin glowed faintly, her lavender eyes reflecting the light in ways that made her seem almost ethereal. She seemed more at ease as she finished eating, finally able to meet his gaze without the weight of desperation clouding her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice clearer now. She pressed her hand to her chest and then gestured toward him, a simple gesture he instinctively understood. "You're welcome," he replied, nodding. Jack wanted to ask her so much, but he didn't know how to begin. She was clearly intelligent, maybe as curious about him as he was about her. For now, they could only rely on their expressions and gestures, a language of shared glances and smiles. It was enough. That night, he let her rest in the cot while he settled on a makeshift bed across the room. He watched her as she drifted into sleep, her breathing slow and peaceful. There was something about her presence that filled the emptiness in the outpost, a warmth that was both unsettling and comforting. For the first time in months, Jack felt something other than the numbing isolation of Eridani Prime. As he lay awake, gazing at her, he couldn't shake the feeling that meeting Zara was more than a mere coincidence. He had saved her life, but in a strange way, he felt she might be saving his. Jack quickly fell into a new routine with Zara. Days turned into weeks, each one blurring into the next as they adapted to each other's presence. The outpost, once a barren sanctuary of isolation, felt alive in a way Jack hadn't known possible. Zara had quickly grown accustomed to human ways of living. She watched him carefully, mirroring his actions with a level of precision that was almost unsettling. She was curious, eager to learn, and every interaction between them felt like the beginning of something unknown. Communication was their first challenge, but they found a language of shared gestures and expressions. When Jack would drink water, Zara would tap her lips to indicate she was thirsty. When she wanted him to join her outside, she'd tilt her head and pat the floor beside her. They began developing subtle signs to communicate emotions, too, a hand over the heart for gratitude, a light touch on the shoulder for reassurance, and a shared smile that meant a world of unspoken things. One evening, after a long day of collecting samples, Jack returned to find Zara waiting by the outpost entrance, holding something behind her back. She had a small, hopeful smile, her lavender eyes gleaming in the dim light. With a flourish, she revealed a small pile of alien berries, bright green and speckled with gold. Jack stared in surprise. He hadn't known anything edible grew on Eridani Prime, but she must have scouted the area herself. With an encouraging nod from Zara, he bit into a berry. It tasted strange, sweet, but with an earthy bitterness he couldn't place. Zara watched his reaction closely, her eyes lighting up when he nodded in approval. They sat together on the floor that night, sharing the berries, an unspoken trust growing between them. Jack was struck by how Zara seemed to treasure every moment, every small gesture of kindness he offered. When he shared a piece of chocolate from his earth rations, her face lit up in pure, childlike joy. She held the chocolate in her mouth, savoring it as if it were a precious gift. That night, as they sat under the twin moons, Zara began to tell him her story. Her words were broken, a mix of her language and the few English words she'd learned, but her meaning was clear. She gestured to the sky, describing a planet she called Ilaria, her home, a lush world of vibrant blue forests and sparkling rivers. Her people, the Ilari, had lived there peacefully for centuries, guided by a deep connection to their environment and each other. But then came the war, the word she knew in English and said with a heavy, sorrowful tone. Another species, the Vrakt, had invaded Ilaria, forcing her people to flee. Zara was one of the few who had been able to escape on a small vessel, which had crashed on Eridani Prime after a system failure. She was the only survivor. Jack listened, captivated and horrified. He could see the pain in her eyes as she spoke, her hands trembling slightly. Her people were scattered, lost across the stars, and she had been alone, believing she would die on this empty planet until he found her. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, a silent promise that she wasn't alone anymore. She leaned into his touch, her face softening, her eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it made his heart ache. In her culture, he realized, she had given him more than her trust. She had shared her very essence, her past, her pain. It was a bond that went beyond mere friendship. Their quiet companionship continued to evolve in ways Jack had never imagined. He began to look forward to seeing her each morning, her gentle smile and eager eyes filling the empty spaces in his heart. He knew he was her lifeline on this planet, but she had become something precious to him too, a tether to a new purpose in the lonely galaxy. One evening, as the violet twilight descended, Zara reached for his hand, tracing the lines of his palm with a delicate finger. She looked up at him with those lavender eyes, a hint of something unspoken glinting within them. Then she pressed her hand to her heart, then to his, and back to hers again, a gesture Jack had seen her use before but hadn't fully understood. "Mate," she said softly, her voice a breathy whisper. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He struggled to process her meaning, the weight of the word hanging between them. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, her trust, her devotion. It was as though she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to understand the depths of what she felt. "Zara, he stammered, unsure how to respond. How could he explain the complexities of human culture, of relationships, of the uncertainty he felt? This wasn't just about them being different species, it was about the unknown, the fear of something so profoundly different yet so enticingly real. She tilted her head, sensing his hesitation. In a soft voice, she said a few words in a language that he didn't understand, but they were filled with warmth, a quiet assurance. She placed her hand over his, guiding it to rest over her heart. He could feel the steady beat beneath his fingers, strong and sure, as if it were reaching out to him. "Promise," she whispered in English, her voice trembling slightly. Jack felt a wave of emotion he couldn't contain. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, under the twin moons, he knew he couldn't turn away from her. He gently squeezed her hand, his fingers entwining with hers. This was uncharted territory, an interstellar bond that transcended their differences, bound by survival, trust, and something that felt alarmingly close to love. As they sat together under the stars, Jack felt a new sense of purpose settle within him. It was a promise, a silent vow to protect her, to cherish her, and to explore this strange, beautiful connection they'd forged in the desolate wilderness of Eridani Prime. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of belonging, not just to another being but to something larger than himself. And as he held Zara's hand, he knew their journey was only beginning. Over the next few weeks, Jack began to notice subtle changes in Zara's behavior. She no longer waited for him to initiate interactions. Instead, she took the lead, gently guiding him through a daily routine they both grew accustomed to. Zara had always been attentive, but now, her focus was unwavering, her every movement filled with an intensity that made Jack realize she saw him as something more than just a friend or savior. It started with small gestures, a careful adjustment of his sleeping quarters to add more padding, a daily ritual of offering him the sweetest alien berries she could find, and lingering glances that made Jack's heart race. He couldn't deny that he felt something profound for her, something that went beyond gratitude or companionship. But he was also wary, unsure of what this connection meant for both of them. One night, as they shared a simple meal of rehydrated earth rations, Zara reached across the table, brushing her fingers against his. Her skin was cool and smooth, and her touch sent a shiver down his spine. She had developed a habit of mirroring his actions, and tonight was no different. She mirrored the way he held his cup, the way he leaned forward when he spoke. It was as though she was studying him, absorbing every aspect of his humanity. But her gaze was different this time, deeper, almost intense. Then, in her soft, melodic voice, she said a single word he hadn't heard before, Nalian. Jack looked at her, puzzled. What does that mean? Zara's cheeks flushed a faint shade of blue, the sign he'd come to recognize as her version of a blush. She struggled for a moment, searching for the right words. Finally, she pointed to her chest, then to him, and back to herself. Mate. Chosen. Life. Jack's pulse quickened as he absorbed the meaning of her words. She was calling him her chosen one, her mate. In that moment, he understood the depth of her feelings, and the realization left him stunned. The look in her lavender eyes was not just one of gratitude or respect. It was one of profound devotion, the kind that transcended language and culture. Zara. Jack stammered, not sure how to respond. He wanted to honor her feelings, but he was also unsure of what he himself wanted. The weight of her gaze, filled with expectation and a quiet kind of hope, was overwhelming. Zara looked down, her expression falling slightly. She must have sensed his hesitation, his uncertainty. Her hand hovered over her heart, a gesture of apology he'd come to recognize. She murmured something in her native language, a soft sound that broke his heart to hear. Before he could respond, Zara abruptly stood, walking toward a corner of the outpost where she'd been working on a strange device. Jack had assumed it was some kind of communications transmitter, something to help her signal her people. But as he looked closer, he realized it was far more complex. The machine was sleek, with flowing lines that almost resembled organic veins, glowing softly with a lavender hue. Zara gestured to the device, her face a mixture of pride and hope. "Bridge of Life," she explained haltingly, as if each word held enormous weight. "What does it do?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara placed a hand over her heart, then gestured toward him, and finally to the device. "Union," she said, looking at him with an intensity that left no room for misunderstanding. Jack stared at the machine, realization dawning on him. This was not just a piece of alien technology, it was a biological incubator, a device designed to allow interspecies reproduction. Zara didn't just see him as a savior or a friend, she wanted to create a future with him, to blend their DNA and create new life, a fusion of both their worlds. The enormity of her intention struck him like a wave. In her culture, feeding her, sharing resources, and caring for her wasn't just kindness, it was a sacred act, a binding promise to be her mate. And Zara had taken that promise to heart. "Zara, this is so much," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He searched her face for any sign of doubt, but all he saw was determination, a quiet conviction that spoke volumes. She was prepared to face this future, this unknown, with him by her side. He felt a swell of emotions, fear, excitement, and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. He had been alone for so long, and here was someone who had crossed galaxies, who had survived unimaginable hardship, and who had chosen him as her partner. The gravity of it was almost too much to bear, yet he found himself reaching for her hand, his fingers entwining with hers. Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Zara's eyes softened, and she nodded, her gaze unwavering. She spoke in her language, and though Jack couldn't understand her words, the sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. She placed a hand on his chest, right over his heart, and then rested her other hand on her own chest, mirroring the gesture. Together, she whispered in English. Jack felt something break open inside him, a dam he hadn't realized he'd built. In that moment, he knew he couldn't turn away from her. Their connection was real, raw, and unlike anything he'd ever felt. This wasn't just a relationship, it was a new kind of union, one that would defy the boundaries of species and culture. He took a deep breath and nodded. Together. Zara's face lit up, her lavender eyes shimmering with joy and relief. She gently guided him toward the device, explaining as best she could that the Bridge of Life would combine their genetic material, creating a hybrid offspring that would carry traits from both their species. The process was delicate, requiring both of their consent and a bond of trust. They stood together before the machine, a blend of fear and hope filling the air. Jack took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Are you ready?" he asked, looking into her eyes. Zara nodded, her expression softening as she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. It was a gesture he recognized as one of intimacy in her culture, a silent affirmation that she was ready to face this journey, this uncharted path, by his side. With a shared look of determination, they activated the device. It hummed softly, casting a gentle glow over the room, bathing them both in a warm, violet light. The Bridge of Life began its work, intertwining their genetic codes, fusing their differences into something new, something that had never existed before. As the device pulsed, a sense of profound connection washed over Jack. He could feel a part of himself merging with her essence, their lives becoming intertwined in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. It was as though the machine was not just merging their DNA, but also binding their souls, uniting them in a way that went beyond biology. As the process neared completion, Zara looked up at him, her expression filled with a quiet awe. She placed a hand over his heart, her gaze full of wonder and tenderness. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. "No," he murmured, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you, Zara. For everything." In that moment, under the violet glow of the Bridge of Life, Jack knew they had forged something truly extraordinary. They had defied the odds, crossed the boundaries of species and culture, and created a future together, one filled with hope, love, and a new beginning. As they stood together, watching the first sparks of life emerge from the device, Jack felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together, as partners, as mates, and as the pioneers of a new kind of love. The days following the activation of the Bridge of Life were filled with a strange, surreal calm. Jack and Zara moved around the outpost with a renewed sense of purpose, their connection deepened in ways that transcended the limits of language. It felt as if they'd entered a silent understanding, a bond so strong it didn't need words. The small incubation device in the corner of their quarters hummed softly, a beacon of their future, a hybrid life form, a blend of two worlds. Jack had never considered himself the paternal type. Back on Earth, he'd lived a life of solitude, driven by a need to escape, to explore the farthest reaches of space and leave his own world behind. But now, every glance he cast at the incubation device filled him with a strange sense of anticipation and joy. There, in that softly glowing pod, was something he'd never imagined, a family. One night, as they sat side by side beneath Eridani Prime's twin moons, Jack felt a wave of curiosity wash over him. "Zara," he asked gently, "what will our child be like? Do you know?" Zara turned to him, her lavender eyes reflecting the pale light of the moons. She placed a hand over her heart and then gestured to the sky, where the stars dotted the night like endless possibilities. "Our child will be Bridge," she said, her English hesitant but filled with meaning. "Half of me, half of you. Away. Between worlds." Jack considered this, struck by the profundity of her words. He realized that their child wouldn't just be a blend of their DNA, they would be a symbol, a living testament to the idea that life could thrive, even between species that had once seemed separated by an insurmountable gulf. It was humbling, and he felt an overwhelming urge to protect this tiny being that would carry pieces of both of them. As the days turned into weeks, Jack and Zara continued to prepare for their new life. Zara taught him more about her culture, her people's rituals, and the Ilari way of life. She described their deep spiritual connection to nature, how they viewed existence as an interconnected web where every life form was a strand. Jack was fascinated by the richness of her heritage, the beliefs and values that shaped her. In return, Jack told her stories about Earth. He described vast oceans and towering cities, the colors of autumn leaves, and the sounds of rain. Zara listened with rapt attention, her eyes wide with wonder. Earth, with all its imperfections, seemed like a place of magic to her. Jack realized that he was no longer homesick. He no longer felt the familiar ache he'd carried with him all those months alone. Now, his home was wherever Zara was, wherever their future lay. One evening, as they shared a quiet meal, the incubation device emitted a soft chime, signaling the final stage of the process. Jack and Zara exchanged a glance, their hands instinctively finding each other's as they approached the device. They held their breath as the soft, translucent shell slowly split open, revealing a small, delicate figure within their child. The infant's skin was a soft iridescent shade, much like Zara's, but with a hint of Jack's tan complexion. Tiny fingers curled in the air, reaching, grasping for something solid in this strange new world. The child's eyes fluttered open, revealing a pair of lavender irises with flecks of deep brown, a perfect blend of both parents. Jack felt his heart swell as he gazed at this fragile, beautiful life they had created together. Zara reached down, gently lifting the child from the pod. She cradled the baby against her chest, a radiant smile on her face. She looked up at Jack, her eyes shimmering with tears of joy. Our child, she whispered, her voice filled with reverence. Our hope. Jack leaned in, placing a gentle hand on his child's tiny head. Hello there, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Welcome to the universe, little one. As they stood together, gazing at their child, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was more than he had ever dreamed possible. He had come to this barren planet seeking isolation, yet he had found love, family, and purpose in the most unexpected way. He realized, in that moment, that this was where he was meant to be. Their child, nestled in Zara's arms, emitted a soft coo, a sound so gentle and pure it made Jack's heart ache with happiness. He knew the journey ahead would not be easy. They were an unconventional family, an anomaly in the galaxy. There would be questions, challenges, perhaps even prejudice from those who couldn't understand their bond. But none of that mattered to him now. They would face it all together, as a family. In the weeks that followed, Jack and Zara adapted to the rhythm of parenthood, finding joy in the small, everyday moments. They spent hours marveling at the tiny details of their child's features, discovering new facets of this little being who was both of them and yet entirely unique. Zara sang Ilari lullabies, soft and melodic, filling the outpost with an ethereal beauty that Jack had come to associate with her presence. Their child, nestled between them, seemed to be a bridge not just between species, but between two souls who had once been worlds apart. The isolation of Eridani Prime, once stifling and lonely, now felt like a sanctuary, a safe haven for their family to grow and thrive. Jack knew that one day they would leave this place, perhaps to find a new home or to reconnect with Zara's scattered people. They would raise their child to be strong, resilient, and compassionate, a beacon of unity in a galaxy that still held so many divides. One night, as they lay beneath the vast expanse of stars, with their child sleeping peacefully between them, Zara turned to Jack, her expression thoughtful. "What do you think will happen when we leave?" she asked, her voice soft, filled with a quiet apprehension. Jack considered her question, his hand gently stroking their child's soft hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together. And maybe we'll show people that love is stronger than any difference." Zara smiled, nodding. "Our child will be hope. Proof that the universe is bigger than fear." Jack tightened his hold on her, feeling a sense of certainty settle within him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would overcome them. Their love had defied boundaries and bridged worlds, and he believed it could conquer anything the universe threw their way. As he lay there, surrounded by his newfound family, Jack gazed up at the stars, his heart brimming with gratitude. He had found something beyond the vastness of space, beyond the cold desolation of a distant planet. He had found a reason to believe in the impossible, to trust in the beauty of the unknown. In the quiet of the night, under the twin moons of Eridani Prime, Jack closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of Zara by his side and the steady breathing of their child. Together, they had forged a new path, a future bound not by species or origin but by love, resilience, and the limitless possibility of what it meant to be truly alive. They were no longer just a human and an alien. They were a family, a fusion of worlds, and a symbol of hope in a galaxy that was, at last, beginning to feel like home.